I still don't tell this story at dinners. People think it's a tall tale, the kind you build up over years until the truth gets buried under the telling. But I was there. I was standing maybe 20 feet from the man when it happened, close enough to see the sweat on his temple, and I have never once gotten the picture out of my head. So let me tell it the way it really went, not the polished version they printed later, the real one. Have you ever watched a man risk everything he has, his job, his name, his pension, his honor, over a flicker of light? Just a flicker. Something most people would have blinked past and forgotten by lunch. That's where this starts, with light, and a man who refused to pretend he hadn't seen it. My name doesn't matter much for this. I was 23 that year, and I had the smallest, most forgettable job in the whole kingdom of Meriden. I worked in the Jewel House. Not as a curator, God, no. I wasn't important enough for that. I was an assistant to the conservation team, which is a fancy way of saying I carried things, labeled things, filled out forms, and once a week I polished the glass on the display cases until my arms ached. The Jewel House sat on the east wing of Home Palace, in the old city of Marrow's End. If you've never been to Meriden, picture gray stone that's gone almost black with age, narrow streets that smell of rain even in summer, and a palace that doesn't try to be pretty so much as it tries to be permanent. It looks like it was carved out of one enormous rock and just decided to stay there for 900 years. The crown jewels lived in the lower vault most of the year, but once every summer on the old king's birthday, King Aldous IV, who'd been dead 2 centuries and whom nobody alive remembered, but tradition is tradition, the Meriden state crown was brought up out of the dark and put on public display in the Great Gallery, for 3 days only, then back down into the vault for another year. That crown was the whole reason tourists came. The whole reason. People flew in from across the world to stand in a slow, shuffling line and look at it for the 40 seconds the guards allowed before nudging them along. And at the center of that crown sat the heart of Meriden. I should tell you about the heart, because you need to understand it to understand the rest. It was a diamond, a huge one, pale blue, almost the color of a winter sky just before snow. Old records said it had been cut by hand 4 centuries ago by a jeweler who supposedly went blind finishing it. That part's probably nonsense, the kind of story that grows around famous stones. But the diamond itself was real enough. I'd seen it under the work lamps maybe a dozen times when conservation brought it up for inspection. I'd watched it throw light around a room like it was alive. You couldn't fake that. When that stone caught a beam, it didn't just shine. It scattered fire in 100 directions, little knives of blue and white that moved when you moved. That's important. Remember that. Real diamonds do something with light that nothing else does. They take it in and they break it apart and they throw it back at you in pieces. Now the guard. His name was Elias Crowe. Guardsman Crowe, 2nd rank, of the Home Palace Ceremonial Guard. And before I tell you what he did, I have to tell you what kind of man he was, or you won't believe the rest of it. You've seen palace guards, maybe not Meriden's, but you've seen the type. They stand at their posts for hours without moving, faces blank, eyes fixed on nothing. Tourists wave their hands in front of them, make jokes, try to make them laugh, and they don't even blink. It's a discipline that takes years to build. Crowe had it in spades. People said he was the stillest man on the whole guard. There was a running joke among the younger soldiers that you could set a clock by Crowe's breathing. But here's the thing about Crowe that the jokes left out. He noticed everything. That stillness, people thought it was emptiness. It wasn't. He was watching, always watching. Behind that blank face, his mind was running the whole time, cataloging every face in the crowd, every shift in the room, every sound that didn't belong. I knew this because Crowe was the only guard who ever talked to me. The rest of them treated the conservation staff like furniture. But Crowe, when his shift ended and mine was just getting started, he'd sometimes stop by the side door and ask how the cleaning was going, or what stone we were working on that week. He was older than me, maybe 40, with gray already coming into his hair at the sides and a quiet, careful way of speaking, like he weighed each word before he let it go. He told me once, leaning against the cold stone of the corridor, that standing post wasn't about looking impressive. Anyone can stand still and look pretty, he said. The job is to see. You stand still so that nothing distracts you from seeing. The stillness is just so you can watch. I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. So the summer of the display, the third year I'd worked there. It started like every other year. The crown came up from the vault on the morning of the first day, escorted by 4 guards and the head of conservation, a stern little woman named Dr. Vance, who treated that crown like it was her own newborn. They settled it onto its velvet stand inside the central case in the great gallery, a case of glass an inch thick, alarmed 6 ways from Sunday, with a single spotlight angled down from above to catch the heart at its center. The gallery itself was a long stone hall with high windows down one side. On a clear morning, the sun came through those windows and laid bright stripes across the floor. Tourists loved that. They'd take photos of the light. But the crown sat in the middle of the room, away from the windows, lit only by that one controlled spotlight, because the curators didn't want sunlight hitting the jewels directly. Too unpredictable, they said. The spotlight gave them a steady, even light they could rely on. That detail's going to matter. Hold on to it. The doors opened to the public at 10, and by 1:30, the line already stretched out into the courtyard. It was a hot day, one of the few Meriden ever got, and people were fanning themselves with their guidebooks, kids whining, somebody's baby crying near the entrance. The air conditioning in that old building was a joke. It clanked and wheezed and barely moved the air. You could smell the crowd by noon. Sunscreen and sweat and the faint dusty smell the old stone always gave off when the weather turned warm. I was working that day, stationed near the back of the gallery with a clipboard, technically there to monitor display conditions, which mostly meant standing around and making sure nobody leaned on the cases. From where I stood, I could see the whole length of the hall, the crown in its glass case, the slow river of tourists shuffling past, and the 2 guards on post. One of them was a young lad named Pell, barely out of training, sweating buckets under his bearskin and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The other was Crowe. Crowe stood at the head of the case on the far side, facing the crowd, still as a statue, the way he always was, bayonet at his shoulder, eyes forward, the picture of a man who could stand there until the building fell down around him. The morning went by like mornings do. Slow, hot, forgettable. I remember being bored. I remember thinking about lunch. I remember a French family arguing about which photo to take, and an old man who stood at the case for so long that Pell had to ask him twice to move along. Nothing unusual, nothing at all. And then the clouds came. You have to understand how ordinary this was. Meriden weather changes like a mood. One minute it's blazing, the next a bank of cloud rolls in off the sea and the whole sky goes gray. It happened that afternoon, maybe around 2. The sun went behind a thick wall of cloud, and the bright stripes of light across the gallery floor faded out, all at once, like someone had dimmed a switch. The whole room got darker, softer. The only strong light left was that single spotlight over the crown. And that's when Crowe moved. Now I need you to understand exactly how strange this was. Crowe never moved, not on post. I'd watched him stand for 3-hour stretches without so much as shifting his weight. But in that moment, when the room dimmed and the spotlight became the only real source of light on the crown, I saw his head turn. Just slightly, maybe 2 inches, his eyes went to the crown, to the heart, and they stayed there. I almost didn't notice it. If I hadn't known him, if I hadn't spent 3 summers watching that man hold himself like carved stone, I'd have missed it completely. But I knew him, and I knew that a turn of the head for Crowe was like another man screaming. Something was wrong. He'd seen something. I followed his eyes to the crown. I stared at the heart of Meriden under that single spotlight, and I saw nothing. Just the diamond sitting there, pale blue, gleaming. It looked fine to me. It looked exactly like it always looked. But Crowe kept staring, and then I watched him do the second impossible thing. He broke his eyeline from the crowd, the cardinal rule, never take your eyes off the people, and he looked across the case directly at young Pell, and I saw his jaw move. He was saying something. Quietly. Out of the side of his mouth, barely moving his lips, the way soldiers learn to talk on parade. Pell's eyes widened. Whatever Crowe said, it rattled him. I drifted closer. I couldn't help it. I came up along the side wall, pretending to check a display placard, until I was near enough to catch the edge of it. "The fire's gone," Crowe was saying. "Low, flat, look at it. The light goes in and nothing comes back. There's no fire in it." Pell whispered something back, too quiet for me to catch. Probably telling him to drop it, to stand his post, to stop talking. But Crowe didn't drop it. I want to stop here for a second and tell you what I understand now that I didn't understand then. What Crowe had seen was this. When the sun was out, the gallery was full of light coming from everywhere, the windows, the reflections off the floor, the whole bright room. Under all that light, almost anything will shine. Glass shines, plastic shines, a child's costume jewel shines. You can't tell anything from a stone that's drowning in light. But when the clouds came and the room dimmed, the only light left on the crown was that single, narrow, controlled spotlight. One source, one direction. And under one clean source of light, a real diamond does that thing I told you about. It takes the light in, breaks it apart, and throws it back in pieces. Fire. Little scattered knives of color. A fake doesn't. A fake glass, crystal, even a very good imitation just glows. It shines back at you in a flat, even way. The light goes in and the light comes out, but it doesn't get broken apart. There's no fire. For 3 summers, that crown had sat under bright, scattered light. Nobody could have told the difference. But the moment the clouds rolled in and stripped the room down to one clean beam, the heart of Meriden stopped throwing fire. And only one man in that room was paying close enough attention to see it. But you don't say a thing like that. Do you understand? You don't. There were maybe 200 tourists in that gallery. There were cameras, there were officials. The crown was insured for a sum I couldn't even imagine, guarded by a system the palace swore was unbreakable. If you're a second-rank guardsman and you announce out loud that the most famous diamond in the kingdom is a fake, you'd better be right. Because if you're wrong, you're finished. Not just fired, finished. Disgraced. The man who panicked and humiliated the crown over a trick of the light. I watched Crowe stand there and I watched him do the arithmetic. I could see it. The whole weight of it crossing his face in that one small turn of the head. Stay quiet, finish the shift, report it through proper channels later, cover yourself, and let the fake sit there for who knows how long while whoever swapped it got further and further away. Or say something now, in front of everyone, and bet his entire life on a flicker of light he'd seen for maybe 4 seconds. He went very still again, stiller than I'd ever seen him, and I remember thinking, he's decided. God help him, he's decided. A tour group was just then reaching the case. A dozen people, led by a guide with a little flag held up over her head. They crowded up to the glass, phones out, leaning in to photograph the heart. And Crowe stepped out of his post. I heard the gasp before I understood it. A guard stepping off his post mid-display in front of a crowd. It was so far outside anything that should ever happen that for a second nobody knew how to react. Pell hissed his name. Crowe. Dr. Vance, who'd been hovering near the entrance, spun around like she'd been slapped. Crowe walked calm, unhurried, deliberate, to the side of the case where the curator's access panel was. And he turned to the room, and in a voice that wasn't loud but carried all the way down that stone hall, a voice with absolute steadiness in it, he said, "This case needs to be closed, right now. Nobody touches the crown, nobody leaves the gallery." The whole room stopped. You could have heard a pin drop on that stone floor. 200 people, a crying baby gone suddenly silent, the clank of the air conditioning the only sound left. Every eye in that gallery turned to the still gray-haired guardsman standing beside the case, having just thrown away every rule he'd ever sworn to follow. Dr. Vance came marching down the hall, her heels cracking against the stone like gunshots, her face white with fury. "Guardsman, what in God's name do you think you are doing? Get back to your post this instant." And Crowe looked at her, steady, calm, and he said the words that started everything. "The heart of Meriden is not in that case," he said. "The stone in that crown is a fake, and it has been for a very long time. I have replayed the next 10 minutes 1,000 times in my head, and I still don't think I've fully made sense of them. Because here's the thing about a man telling the truth in a room that doesn't want to hear it. The truth doesn't land all at once. It lands in pieces. First there's silence, then there's anger, and only much, much later, sometimes too late, there's belief." Crowe got the anger first. Dr. Vance stood there in front of 200 tourists, and I watched the color climb up her neck and into her face. She was not a woman used to being contradicted. She'd run that jewel house for 11 years. The crown was her life's work. And here was a second-rank guardsman, a man whose entire job, as far as she was concerned, was to stand still and look noble, telling her, in front of the whole world, that she'd been guarding a fake. "You will return to your post," she said. Her voice had gone very low and very tight. "You will return to your post and you will be silent, and if you do not, I will have you removed from this building in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" Crowe didn't move. "I understand you, doctor," he said. "And I'm telling you that the moment you walk me out of this building, you lose your only chance to catch whoever did this before they're gone. Close the case. Lock the doors. Test the stone. If I'm wrong, arrest me. I'll go quietly, but test it first." That stopped her. I saw it stop her, because there was no panic in his voice, no wildness. That was the thing about Crowe. Even in the middle of throwing his whole life away, he sounded like a man reading off a list. And a calm man is much harder to dismiss than a frightened one. The tourists had started to murmur now. Phones were up. Somebody near the front was filming the whole thing, and I remember thinking, distantly, the way you think strange thoughts in a crisis, that this was going to be on screens all over the world by nightfall, whatever happened next. Young Pell had gone the color of paper. He kept looking from Crowe to Vance and back, his bayonet still at his shoulder, frozen, not knowing whose order to follow. There's nothing in the training for this. Nobody ever teaches you what to do when one superior tells you to seize a man, and the man being seized is the only one telling the truth. It was the head of palace security who broke the deadlock. A heavy-set man named Garrow came pushing through the crowd from the entrance, drawn by the commotion. He had a radio in one hand and a face like thunder, and he took one look at the scene, the guard off his post, the curator white with rage, 200 phones recording, and he made the decision that I think probably saved everything. "Doors," he said into his radio. "Seal the gallery. Nobody in, nobody out now." Vance rounded on him. "Garrow, you cannot seriously." "With respect, doctor," Garrow said, "I'd rather lock the doors for an hour and look foolish than open them and let a thief walk out the front. We seal it, we test the stone, we sort it out. If the guardsman's wrong, we apologize to everyone and let them go. Costs us an hour. If he's right, he didn't finish that. He didn't need to." I heard the locks engage. A heavy, final sound all down the length of the gallery. The great doors at the entrance and the two side doors and the curator's access at the back. Sealed. 200 tourists, a dozen staff, 4 guards, and 1 fake diamond, all shut inside one long stone room together. The mood in that crowd shifted the second those locks went home. Up to then, it had been a spectacle, a strange show to film and laugh about later. Now it was something else. Now people understood they weren't allowed to leave. A ripple of unease went through the line. Somebody asked loudly what was happening. A child started to cry again. The air felt thicker than it had a minute before, and it wasn't just the broken air conditioning. Vance, cornered now, did the only thing left to her. She decided to prove Crowe wrong as fast as humanly possible. "Fine," she snapped. "Fine, we'll test it. And when it comes back genuine, and it will, I want this man's name, his rank, and his discharge papers on my desk by the end of the day." They didn't open the case in front of the crowd. Garrow had the tourists moved down to the far end of the gallery, herded behind the rope barriers, while a screen was pulled across to block the view of the central case. I was allowed to stay, partly because I was conservation staff, partly, I think, because in all the chaos nobody remembered to send me away. So I saw what happened behind that screen. Very few people did. Vance Keed opened the case herself. Her hands were steady. I'll give her that, whatever she was feeling, her hands didn't shake. She lifted the crown out of its velvet stand with the careful, two-handed reverence of someone handling something they love, and she set it down on a padded conservation tray. Up close under the work lamp she clicked on, the heart of Meriden looked perfect. Pale blue, flawless, exactly as I remembered it from every inspection I'd ever stood through. She pulled on her gloves. She reached for the loupe, the little magnifying eyepiece every jeweler carries, and she bent over the stone. I watched her face. I have never before or since watched a person's certainty fall apart in real time the way it fell apart on Dr. Vance's face in that moment. She looked through the loupe at the heart of Meriden, and for 2 or 3 seconds nothing happened. And then her brow creased, and she went very still, and she turned the crown a little to catch the light differently and looked again, and again, and the color that had flooded her face with anger drained right back out of it until she was paler than Pell had been. She straightened up. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at the stone like it had betrayed her personally. "It's wrong," she said finally, very quietly, almost to herself. "The girdle's wrong. The facets are these are wrong, this isn't." She stopped. She picked up the diamond tester from the conservation kit, the little electronic probe that reads thermal conductivity, the one tool that doesn't care about your opinion, that just tells you cold and flat whether a stone moves heat the way a diamond does or the way an imitation does. She pressed it to the stone. It beeped. She read it, and then she sat down. Just sat down, right there on the floor beside the tray, in front of all of us, like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her up. "It's not a diamond," she said. "It's not, it's a synthetic, it's good. It's a very, very good synthetic, but it's not the heart." Nobody spoke. I remember the clank of the air conditioning. I remember Garrow letting out a long, slow breath through his nose. I remember young Pell making a small sound, like the start of a word he didn't finish. And I remember Crowe. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't even look relieved, which is what I'd have expected. He just closed his eyes for a second, only a second, and then opened them, and went straight to the next problem, the way he always did. "Then it didn't leave the building 5 minutes ago," he said. "Whoever did this had time to make a synthetic that good. That's not a smash-in grab. That's months of work, which means the real stone has been gone a long time, and the person who took it is probably someone we trust." That sentence went through the room like a cold draft. Because he was right, and everyone understood it at once. A fake that good doesn't get made overnight in a back alley. Someone had measured the heart, studied it, photographed every facet, every flaw, the exact dimensions of the girdle, and then had a synthetic grown and cut to match it precisely. That takes access. Real access. The kind of access a tourist shuffling past a 1-inch thick glass case in 40 seconds does not have. The kind of access that conservation staff have, that curators have, that guards have. I felt the floor tilt under me a little, because I was conservation staff. I'd been in the room with that stone a dozen times, and as the thought crossed my mind, I saw the same thought cross every face behind that screen, each of us looking at the others, each of us suddenly aware that we were now all suspects, sealed into one room together, and that one of us almost certainly knew exactly where the real heart of Meriden was. Vance got back to her feet. The shock was hardening into something else now, fury again, but a colder kind, aimed not at Crowe anymore, but at whoever had done this to the thing she'd given her life to protect. "The inspection logs," she said. Every time that crown came up from the vault, it was logged. Every hand that touched it signed for. If someone swapped it, they did it during an inspection, and there'll be a record. She turned to Garrow. I need the logs, all of them. Going back, she hesitated, and I watched the horror of it land on her. Going back however far we have to. Here's the part that still gives me chills. It was Crowe who knew when it had happened. Not from the logs, from memory. You won't find it in one inspection, he said. It wasn't swapped in one go. It couldn't have been too much risk, too many eyes. It was swapped slowly, piece by piece, visit by visit. He looked at the crown on the tray. I've stood post over this stone for 9 summers, Doctor. The first year I noticed how it threw fire. It used to fill the whole case with it when the sun caught it. I used to, he stopped, and for the first time something almost like grief crossed his face. I used to look forward to it. 3 days a year. I'd watch it scatter that blue light all over the ceiling, and I'd think, I'm standing guard over the most beautiful thing in the kingdom. He paused. 3 summers ago it was a little less. 2 summers ago less again. This year under that bright window light I told myself I was imagining it, that my eyes were getting old, that the spotlight had been changed. He shook his head slowly. But when the clouds came in just now and stripped the room down to that one beam, there was no fire left at all. None. And I knew I hadn't imagined 3 years of it fatting. I just spent 3 years refusing to believe what I was seeing. Nobody said anything. It wasn't taken all at once, Crowe finished. It was taken over years, by someone patient, someone who came back again and again, and each time made the copy a little more complete, and trusted that nobody would ever look closely enough under the right light to tell the difference. And then, and I will never forget this as long as I live, Crowe turned his head slowly and looked down the length of the gallery, past the screen, toward the far corner where the staff and officials who'd been pulled aside were standing in a nervous cluster. And his eyes settled on one man. A man I knew, a man we all knew, a quiet, well-liked, utterly unremarkable member of the conservation team. A man who had been there longer than I had, longer than almost anyone, who had access to the vault inspections, who handled the crown more often than anyone except Vance herself, and who right at that moment was standing very, very still, with a small leather satchel held against his chest, and an expression on his face that I can only describe as the look of a man who has just realized the cloud came in at the worst possible moment of his entire life. Crowe's voice was very quiet. "Doctor," he said, without taking his eyes off the man, "I think you should ask Mr. Halloway why he's holding his bag so tightly." Every head in that room turned. And Halloway ran. Think a man can't run far in a sealed room. You'd be right, but you'd be surprised how much damage a cornered person can do in the few seconds they've got, when they know it's the end and they've got nothing left to lose. Halloway didn't run for a door. He was clever enough to know the doors were locked. He ran for the case. I think, and I've had years to think about it, that in that last desperate moment his plan wasn't escape at all. It was destruction. If he couldn't get out with what was in his satchel, then he'd make sure nobody could ever prove what it was. He went straight for the open conservation tray where the crown sat, and I understood, a half-second too late, that he meant to grab it, to smash it, to do something, anything, that would turn the whole thing into chaos and doubt, and a mess of broken evidence nobody could ever untangle. He never reached it. Crowe was 20 feet away on the wrong side of the case, with a curator and a security chief between him and the running man. He had no chance of getting there in time, and he didn't try. What he did instead was the single fastest, clearest piece of thinking I've ever seen a human being do under pressure. He didn't go for Halloway. He went for the crown. He stepped across, scooped that crown off the tray with both hands, gently. Even then, even in that half-second, I swear his hands were gentle, and he turned his whole body away from Halloway, curling around the crown the way you'd curl around a child, putting his own back between the running man and the thing he was sworn to protect. Halloway hit him full force. Both of them went down, And Crowe took the fall on his shoulder and his hip against that hard stone floor, with the crown tucked against his chest and his arms wrapped around it, and he did not let go. It was Garrow and Pell who pulled Holloway off him. Young Pell, frozen, useless Pell, who hadn't known whose order to follow 10 minutes earlier, moved like lightning the moment there was something he understood. He had Holloway's arm twisted up behind his back before the man could get to his feet, and Garrow had the satchel, and it was over. Just like that. Quicker than it takes to tell. Crowe lay on the floor for a moment, getting his breath. Then he sat up slowly, the crown still held against him, and he checked it. Turned it over in his hands, looking for damage. There wasn't any. He'd taken the whole fall himself rather than let it touch the ground. Dr. Vance crouched down beside him. And this woman who, 15 minutes earlier, had promised to have him discharged in handcuffs. She put her hand on his shoulder, and her voice cracked when she spoke. "Give it to me," she said softly. "You've done your part, let me take it now." And he did. He handed her the crown, fake stone and all, and she held it the way he had, like something alive. They opened the satchel right there on the floor. I was close enough to see. We all crowded in: Garrow, Vance, 2 more guards who'd come through once the doors were unsealed, and me, forgotten in the corner as usual, seeing everything. Inside the satchel were tools. The fine, specialized tools of a master jeweler, picks and loops and tiny clamps, the kind of kit you'd use to set a stone. And wrapped in a square of gray cloth, nested in the middle of it all, was a small velvet pouch. Vance opened the pouch with shaking fingers. And there it was, the heart of Meriden, the real one, loose, unset, sitting in the palm of her hand, and the moment it came out of the cloth and into the light of the work lamp, the whole thing came alive. Fire everywhere. Blue and white knives of light scattering across the floor, across the ceiling, across our faces, the way Crowe had described it, the way it was supposed to. I heard somebody behind me draw in a sharp breath. You didn't need a loop or a tester to know. You could see it. The real one and the fake one sat side by side now, the loose stone in Vance's hand and the set stone in the crown, and once you saw them together, the difference was so obvious it was almost laughable. One threw fire, the other just glowed. How had Holloway done it? The full story came out over the following weeks, and it was almost exactly what Crowe had guessed. Holloway had spent the better part of 3 years on it. He'd had a synthetic grown to match the heart's measurements then, and this was the patient, careful, monstrous part. He hadn't swapped the whole thing at once. Each summer, during the inspection when the crown came up from the vault and conservation had it alone on the bench, he'd done a little more of the work, refined the cut of his synthetic to match, loosened the real stones setting a fraction, built up his copy and worn down the original's mounting, visit by visit, year by year, until the swap could be done in a single quiet afternoon. He'd made the switch the day before the display. The plan, as best anyone could reconstruct it, was to walk the real heart out of the building in that satchel during the chaos of the public display, when staff came and went constantly and nobody counted bags. He'd nearly done it. If the weather had held, if the sun had stayed out and kept the gallery full of that bright, scattered, forgiving light, he'd have walked out the front door with the heart of Meriden in his bag and the fake sitting pretty in its case. And it might have been years before anyone realized, if anyone ever did. But the clouds came in, and under one clean beam of light, in front of the one man in the kingdom who'd spent 9 summers watching that stone throw fire and had quietly noticed it fatting, the fake had nowhere to hide. That's what undid him. Not a guard, not a lock, not an alarm, a cloud and a man who paid attention. Here's the part I think about most, though. It isn't the chase, or the satchel, or even the moment the real stone came out and threw its fire around the room. It's the cost. Because when Crowe stepped off his post and said those words, he didn't know any of this. He didn't know about Holloway. He didn't know about the satchel or the 3 years of patient work. All he had was a flicker of light that wasn't there anymore. That's all, a flicker. And on the strength of that, he chose to throw his whole life onto the scale. 9 years of service, his rank, his name, his pension, everything. He bet it all on something he'd seen for 4 seconds and couldn't prove, in a room full of cameras, against a superior who'd promised to destroy him. I asked him about it. Months later, when it had all settled, when the medals had been handed out and the reporters had gone away, and the heart of Meriden was back in its case under a new security protocol that Crowe himself had helped design. We were standing in that same corridor where he used to ask me how the cleaning was going. And I asked him, "What made you so sure? How did you know it was worth the risk?" And he was quiet for a while, and then he said something I've carried with me ever since. "I wasn't sure," he said. "That's the thing people don't understand. I wasn't sure at all. I thought I was probably going to lose everything." He looked out the window for a moment. "But I'd been pretending not to see it fade for 3 years. 3 years of standing there, looking right at it, telling myself I was imagining things because the truth was inconvenient and I didn't want the trouble." He shook his head slowly. "And I decided I'd rather lose my job for telling the truth than keep it for one more day of pretending. That's all it was. It wasn't bravery. I was just tired of looking away." He never did take credit, you know. The papers called him a hero. The palace gave him a commendation and a promotion he hadn't asked for. There was talk of putting his name on a plaque, and every time he deflected it. He'd say he'd just been doing his job, that the job was to see and he'd seen. That anyone standing where he stood, paying attention the way you're supposed to pay attention, would have done the same. But that's not true. That's the part he never accepted. 200 people stood in that gallery that afternoon. A dozen of us were trained staff, curators who'd handled the stone, security men whose whole job was vigilance, guards who'd stood the same post. We all looked at the same crown under the same dimming light. Only one of us saw. And the difference between him and the rest of us wasn't his eyes. It was that, when he saw something that was going to cost him everything to say out loud, he said it anyway. I left the Jewel House a few years after that. Moved on, did other things the way you do. But I went back once, a long time later on a gray afternoon, and I stood in that gallery as a tourist myself, shuffling through the line like everyone else. The crown was there. The heart of Meriden throwing its fire around the case, blue and white, exactly as it should. And there was a guard on post. Not Crowe, he'd long since retired by then. A young one, still and straight-backed, face like stone, eyes forward, the picture of a man who could stand there until the building fell down around him. And I found myself wondering, the way I suppose I'll always wonder now, whether that young guard was really empty behind that blank face, or whether, like Crowe, he was watching everything. Ready, if the moment ever came, to be the one person in a crowded room who refused to look away. I hope so. The whole thing only works if someone is. That's the story. That's how it really went. A diamond, a cloud, and a tired man who decided the truth was worth more than his own quiet life. Most days. I think that's the bravest thing a person can do. Not run into fire. Not fight off a thief. Just stand in a room full of people who don't want to hear it and say the thing you saw out loud in your own voice, knowing what it might cost you. Crowe saw the fire go out of a diamond. I think the rest of us are still learning how to see it all.